Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to Nonfiction November, a BookTube event created by Olive at a Book Olive, designed to get you to read more nonfiction than you already do, or get you to read some nonfiction if you're one of the large contingent of readers who think that nonfiction is boring. They're associated with schoolwork. I want to participate a lot in Nonfiction November. I read a lot of nonfiction in a given year anyway. It's a large chunk of what I read. I love it. Feeling a little under the weather today, so this will be a short video. But I wanted to highlight another book for Nonfiction November. This is from 1978. This is Lord David Cecil's biography of Jane Austen, a portrait of Jane Austen. Not a long thing. And at the beginning of it, he nods at two recent biographers of Jane Austen and says, I mean no disrespect, to write a biographical sketch of my own. Everybody brings something different to the tiny little number of facts that we know about Jane Austen in terms of the usual fodder for a biographer. And you could say the same thing if you wanted to. You could look forward and say the same thing about the 6 Jane Austen biographies that appeared after this, or the 60 that appeared after this. There have been some very famous ones in the last 10 years, but they all have the same tiny little 2-inch span to work on. We don't know a whole lot about who Jane Austen was as a person. We can infer it from her works. We can infer it from what little biographical information we do have. But thanks to her sister, we'll never have a full portrait. Her sister burned 90% of her correspondence, and destroyed who knows how much of what else, all the mementos and ephemera that accumulated in a life. So the ability that trove of material would have given us to know this person, that ability is largely gone. So all we're left with is a silhouette of the period. All we're left with is, well, the same well-worked over patch of ground that all biographers deal with when they deal with this author. When you go to a new Jane Austen biography, you're going to look for historical insights. You're going to look for the author's perception or lack thereof about the novels. Of course, the author of any Jane Austen biographies, inventiveness when it comes to interpreting the letters that we do still have, all of that is what you'll go for. You won't go because an author has really made use of an unknown or underutilized body of primary documents. There aren't any. And David Cecil he's a perfect example of that, because that's true, because every biographer of Jane Austen is really biographing themselves. really what you're getting is so-and-so's version of Jane Austen. Because that's true, you look for the themes that are coming out in any one book. If someone is a working Fleet Street journalist and a woman working in a man's field and has had to work for every honor that she's got, and she writes a biography about Jane Austen, well, that biography will likely reflect those qualities. It will likely give us a Jane Austen who scrabbled to become a best-selling author, who was proud of it, who looked over her contracts and knew her competitors. If you have someone who comes at this from a different point of view, you'll get essentially a different Jane Austen, or at least you'll have different tones that will be emphasized. And David Cecil is a perfect example of that. This is someone who comes from privilege, to put it mildly. comes from privilege, and values it. Values the ability to go to the kitchen, go to the dining room for breakfast. The breakfast will be on a sideboard. It's never not going to be there. You don't know how it gets there, but it's never not going to be there. And then when you're done and you're nice and full and the conversation has been done, then you can retire to either your south-facing writing room or your north-facing writing room and get to work on a book, for which the arms of publishing houses will be wide open whenever you choose to finish that book. The publishing houses will be saying, oh, well, Lord David, we'd love to take your book. That's going to produce a different view of Jane Austen than the example that I just cited. Jane Austen came from that world. We sometimes forget it, but she came from a world of well-heeled comfort, and probably, aside from physically, never knew any discomfort in her life. And Cecil tells us that over and over again. He mentions at one point here, he's talking about Jane Austen's juvenilia, which unfortunately we have. I wish we didn't. I wish it weren't the subject of 1,500 doctoral dissertations every year. It's fairly insubstantial, but he's writing about it, and he writes, altogether, these first trifling works do turn out, on investigation, to tell us a great deal about Jane Austen, the artist, about the primary nature of her inspiration and the history of its development. We learn from them that she was a precocious genius in her style, in her power of observation, in her characteristic vein of humor. No offense to his lordship, but we don't learn anything of the kind in those books. That's a pure Janeite, just spouting religion. This precocity was encouraged by favorable circumstances. The world she lived in was peaceful, stable, and secure. It gave her time and tranquility to follow her literary bent. Further, though it did not look up to a writer as a superior kind of being, it was not Philistine. On the contrary, it was cultivated and literary. Many of the Austens wrote themselves. For this very reason, though they enjoyed Jane's work, they did not make too much of it, did not encourage her in such a way as to make her self-conscious or ambitious to attempt tasks beyond her powers. The mental climate in which she grew up enabled her genius to develop unhampered, undistracted, unforced. You can see what I mean. We're finding at least as much of the biographer as the subject in passages like that. Especially that word peaceful, which crops up over and over again in this book, just over and over. Another element that comes up throughout this book is David Cecil's really good ability to dramatically summon on the page, all of Austen's family. That is really well done. I've read sketches of Jane Austen that largely lavished that kind of energy on her sister Cassandra and stopped there. So it's really great to see, all of the nephews and all of the menfolk brought out so effectively in this book, especially probably in the second half of the book. If there's a star in the second half of the book, it's her nephew Edward, who first met her as a 16-year-old. They first got to know each other when he was 18. He was smart and well-spoken at 18. He was also super hottie. That helped for Jane Austen. We infer. We get little glimpses here and there. Probably we would learn a lot more about that side of her if her sister hadn't committed the unpardonable crime of destroying the literary effects of what her sister knew perfectly well was a great writer. No one should have that power. But after Jane Austen has died, she dies a very peaceful death. That word comes up over and over again. She's surrounded by family. She knows that it's coming. She prepares for it. Lord David has a weird little aside about how this really proves the value of having an extended loving family, because they're going to be there for you at the end. They'll be changing your chamber pot and helping you to sit up, and you'll lay your head on their shoulder for your last minute. But he then extends his narrative past the deathbed just a bit. He shows us, for instance, this paperback is illustrated, and he shows us the Winchester house where Jane Austen dies. He mentions the bow window where she looked out on the world forever and ever. But then he gives us a little portrait of Edward in later life, and I thought I'd read it to you because it continues that theme of getting to know the biographer through a biography of someone else, through a biography of Jane Austen. He writes this wonderful encomium to Edward. He too, but in masculine manifestations, continued the Austen tradition, so faithfully indeed that an account of his life and interests might seem to my readers like a repetition of the earlier pages of this book. Like his grandfather, he was a scholarly, sociable country clergyman who educated his children at home largely by reading aloud to them. Like his father and Uncle Henry, he wrote light verses and took part in private theatricals. Like most male Austens, he enjoyed in his youth dancing and fishing and shooting. Lucky and possessed of a natural charm, he won the heart of his capricious great aunt, Mrs. Lee Perrott, who made him her heir to her fortune. He was able, with its help, to lead a blameless and comfortable existence till his death at the age of 71, liked and respected by his neighbors, and again, like his grandfather, the center of an unusually united and devoted family. So much amiability and respectability and good luck perversely inclines one to fancy him as a little insipid and conventional. In fact, he was the most distinguished personality produced by the younger generation of the Austen family. His letters show that the quick, civilized intelligence and warm, responsive sweetness of nature that had drawn his Aunt Jane to him as a boy of 16 remained with him all his life. He was also a born writer. In 1870, he wrote a memoir of Jane Austen built around his personal recollections of her. It is a charming little work of art, gracefully written and vividly evoking her personality. Edward Austen does not, it is true, tell us much about his aunt as author, but to do so would have been inconsistent with his purpose, which was to depict her as he remembered her, and as she appeared to the people who knew her. A very courteous and comfortable assessment of a courteous and comfortable life. Comfort comes up over and over again in this book. I think the cover of this edition was probably well chosen. It comes up over and over again that to David Cecil, Jane Austen is a perfect illustration of Virginia Woolf's contention in her famous book that a woman needs an income of her own, a private income in a room of her own in order to write. Jane Austen famously didn't have that, didn't take advantage of it. She could have had a private study that she would just retreat to at all times, but she famously didn't, or at least we think she didn't. Who knows, again, what that gigantic pile of letters that her sister burned actually say about how Jane Austen worked or what it was like to be around her when she was writing a novel. We think we know that, but there are 100,000 details we'll never know. But that is my nonfiction entry for today, is a portrait of Jane Austen by David Cecil, who's most famous, I think, probably for either this book or his book on Lord Melbourne. His book on Lord Melbourne has a lot more primary material to deal with and is wonderful, just wonderful. This is also a wonderful, graceful writer on the page. I think when he was talking about Edward Austen, he probably had a lot of himself in mind to do as a quiet country gentleman who can write all day long if he wants to. Again, if you were to go to a different Jane Austen biography, you would get a very different Jane Austen, as different as can be. The DNA would still be the same. But that's my nonfiction November pick for today. Sorry not to go on at great length. I'm tempted to do it about Jane Austen. I always am, but I feel a little under the weather, a little bit icky, so I'm going to wrap this up. But I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.